The chapel lights were a cruel, clinical white, the kind of light that shows every flaw and leaves no shadows for mercy. 30 pairs of eyes hung on me like verdicts. My dress felt suddenly heavy, not with silk and lace, but with the weight of a life I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 32 years. Other people's expectations, other people's debts, other people's decisions masquerading as love. They called my name, and the room inhaled. I walked down the aisle because that's what I had always been trained to do. Be graceful, be small, make everyone else comfortable. My father's jaw was set, and my mother's hand trembled ever so slightly on my father's arm, a practiced gesture of sympathy. My brother, the golden child, smiled the kind of smile that costs nothing and takes everything. My cousins, their faces lacquered with loyalty, mouthed the lines that had been rehearsed for years in 100 cruel variations. You're lucky, honey. It's for the family. Think of reputation. They didn't expect a scene. They expected my collapse. They'd spent my life scripting me into the tragic role. Tonight, they wanted a finale, a public unraveling that would finally justify every slight, every aside, every dismissive, "You'll understand when you're older." What they got was silence, and then the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and steady as a drum. I didn't run. I didn't faint. I stood up at the altar and watched them hand me my own humiliation on a silver tray. My husband-to-be, Julian, smiled at me like a man who believed he had bought all he wanted with charm and words. He had been kind. For a time. He'd seemed like a harbor after years of stormy shores. But kindness is porous. It takes the shape of the freer person it encounters. And I was tired of being that porous woman who would dissolve to fix everyone else. Then the truth came like a gif you can't stop, my father's voice, calm as a bank statement, addressing the congregation as if he were closing a corporate meeting rather than rupturing a daughter's life. "Kira," he said, loud enough that every whisper turned toward him, "we need to speak about family, about stewardship, about what preserves the legacy." He spoke of stewardship like someone signing off on mergers. He spoke of legacy like a ledger. My stomach dropped when I realized which ledger he meant. "My daughter's marriage," he said, "what was a wonderful plan. But given recent events and responsibilities, Vivian and I have decided it's best to reassign certain assets and obligations before the union is formalized." And then, like an executioner, folding the blade neatly back into its sheath, he announced that the prenuptial agreement had been revised, in the other party's favor. Not only would my family withhold my grandmother's trust fund that I had been promised, they would also strip me of any access to the family home I had poured my savings into for the last 10 years, under the pretense that it was helping the family. At the end, he smiled as if he had given everyone tickets to the opera. My new husband, Julian, applauded. So did most of the pews. My mother dabbed at her cheeks, surgical sympathy in hand, while my brother laughed, a quick, sharp sound that sounded like a verdict made flesh. That was the moment the aisles felt unreal, as if I were in a film, and the camera had mistakenly stayed on me too long. I had been trained to accept, to bend, to be thankful for crumbs. Tonight they expected the greatest crumb of all, my public defeat. But I had been gathering a different kind of currency these last years, invisible to them. I had been recording, not out of paranoia, but because being the family's emotional errand teaches you to keep receipts. "I'm sorry," my father said, the practiced regret of a man who believed himself merciful. "This is the only way to protect Malcolm's future." Malcolm, my brother, the golden child who absorbed sunlight and never learned warmth. He had been sick for 4 years. A kind, convenient story for a family that liked suffering only when it elevated them. They paraded their grief in charity galas, photographed the right angles of broken hands clasped with black tie donors. It looked good on their mantle. I had paid for his miracle treatment. I had cashed out everything, my condo, a small investment that had been my life's quiet pride, the one I'd insisted on buying with my own labor. I had borrowed against hope and sent it overseas for a treatment they told me was the only thing that would work. I had signed the wire transfer with hands that shook, but I signed. And when I asked who would reimburse me, my father's eyes were sharp and final. "We're taking care of it. Don't ask questions." So I'd been the bank and the fool. I'd been the only steady, quiet hand in a family of polished smiles. And now, in the sanctuary meant for vows, they pronounced judgment. My sacrifice meant nothing. My giving was a ledger entry they could simply reverse. I remember breathing in that chapel and feeling a change inside me, like the moment when someone finally names the wound out loud. The world reframed itself as not the place to be small in anymore, but the place to stand up. "Excuse me," I said. My voice didn't tremble. It felt like a new muscle. I pressed a small button hidden in my palm and put the speaker icon on. The room stared as my lawyer's voice, Ben, unfurled over the oak like a blade. I had put him on speaker 2 weeks earlier, cheeky and certain, and then forgotten him in the rush. I placed the phone on the podium. The microphone picked up every word as if the heavens themselves were an auditor. "Kira," Ben said, quiet and precise. "Are you there?" "I'm here," I answered, and then I watched my father's face mortify as Ben's voice turned a shade colder. "Members of this room," Ben's voice carried, "you are now being recorded. The following conversation will be logged." My father's hand clenched the edge of the lectern as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the idea of control. My mother's eyes darkened. The fabric of her composure had been tugged, and she smelled its seam. Ben explained, with clinical patience, that during the past 4 years, my family had been photographed claiming responsibility for my brother's expenses, that they had publicly accepted donations and phrased them as family contributions. He said the words fraud and misrepresentation in a way that made my mother's spine stiffen. Ben continued, and the room's warmth thinned. He said 5 sentences that felt like the coldest cleanup. By diverting trust assets in the name of family stewardship without proper disclosure and acknowledging the origin of funds for medical care, he read, "You have effectively triggered specific contingency clauses in agreements executed by Ms. Kira Vance. Those agreements include a personal loan note for $475,000 signed by Joseph and Vivian Vance, which names the family home and corporate holdings as secondary collateral. Upon default, collateral rights transferred to Ms. Kira Vance." Blank faces, a tableau of faltering entitlement. My father's throat worked like a fish struggling for air inside a trap he'd set for someone else. My mother's voice was small. "We never signed—" "You did," Ben answered. 4 years ago. Mr. Harrison has a copy. We'll be filing this in court. And as of midnight tonight, the transfers reversing Ms. Vance's trust allocation will be frozen pending litigation. It was a surgical strike, precise and inevitable. My father looked like he'd been told the ocean had decided the shore had shifted. The congregation shifted uneasily. The comfortable chairs of gossip, privilege, and assumed invulnerability suddenly squeaked. It was not humiliation that crossed the room after that. It was something worse for them. Exposure. They gathered themselves, powerfully practiced armor, and tried to claw the narrative back, but everyone's lips had been caught by the same new fact. Their little theater of nobility was a ledger with missing entries. I left that chapel minutes later without my bouquet and without the vows, because vows signed under the weight of bad faith mean nothing. I left to the sound of shocked whispers, but my steps were steady. I had 1 suitcase, a car waiting with a good friend at the curb, and a new plan in my head. The humiliation they'd intended had become the moment of my pivot. Months passed, and the legal battle unfurled like an old map. Familiar lines, new territories. I found no joy in courtrooms, but I learned to love the arithmetic of contracts. I turned their own tools against them. Transparency, filings, witness statements, bank records. The truth was not dramatic. It was patient and meticulous. That's when I met Sebastian Hale. He was the last person I expected in my life, a billionaire in a dark cardigan who drank coffee like water and read legal briefs like bedtime stories. He was also the only person, apart from my grandmother, who had ever looked right through my mother's practiced grief and seen the ledger behind the face. My mother had hated him long before anyone knew why. She called him everything from an interloper to a publicity opportunist, insults that landed thin because no one could define them. For her, hatred of Sebastian was almost theological, part of the catechism of keeping the Vaunt's name unsmudged by outsiders. The truth was odder and kinder. Sebastian's father had been a mechanic on the same block my grandmother had taught children in a basement room. The two families had crossed paths once, years ago, at a community fundraiser. My grandmother, Esther, who'd built everything from grit and thrift, had been kind to him. Sebastian's rise to wealth had been violent and meteoric, but he never forgot the hand that pushed him up. One evening, after an arraignment had left me raw but not defeated, I found a note at the firm's receptionist desk. "You aren't alone." I nearly trashed it as a prank. Then curiosity, that cheap, tenacious animal, bit my elbow, and I followed the note to a coffee shop on the far side of the courthouse. There he was, half a notebook, half a quietly furious smile, watching the city like a chessboard. He stood up and offered a hand. "You must be Kira," he said, and his voice sounded like someone who had decided long ago to choose his battles carefully. "I've been following the Vance saga. My grandmother loved your grandmother. She used to bring you pie sometimes, if I remember correctly." He didn't say it like an ally. He said it like a man offering a balance sheet, the past owed, the past repaid. That evening, he told me two things that changed the geometry of my fight. First, your parents played this like a chess match, not a family crisis. They think in asset disposition, not in people. That gives away their moves. Second, you don't have to be small to be kind. He was a stranger who refused to be a stranger. He lent me resources slow and steady, introductions to forensic accountants, quiet letters to newspapers that asked questions about celebrity philanthropy, and, when the trial made the tabloids twist my face into caricature, a security team who kept me out of harm's way. He never asked for favors. He never demanded a headline. He gave me the exact thing that makes quiet people dangerous: leverage. My mother, ever suspicious, sniffed around him like a predator smelling money it couldn't possess. "He's trying to buy you," she hissed once, all the grace of an accusation used as a talisman. "His money is a different kind of chain." He laughed once, a small honest sound. "That's the opinion of the insecure," he said, and then, looking at me, softened. "I'm giving you options. Take them." Options are a rare weather in my life. I learned to accept them. With them, I kept going. The court case unfolded like the kind of soap opera people love to hate. Late-night legal wrangling, revelations that made my father's jaw tighten, depositions that painted them in the light of greed and performative grief. We uncovered bank wires, hotel receipts, photos from private suites. We uncovered the fact that the family-run charitable fund that had been presented as the family's effort had been a front for donors who thought they were paying for research, not for stage-managed nobility. There were painful days when other people's gossip felt like an infection. There were days when I wanted to crawl back into that small, obedient body they loved. It was easier to be hated predictably than to stand naked in truth. But standing naked in truth has an odd power. People either come at you with fury, or they step away in surprise. A few, like my grandmother's old friends, stepped closer. They called me at odd hours. They told me stories of Esther that were tender and scandalous, how she had once ripped a checkbook from a councilman's hand because he tried to buy votes with charity, how she'd given away the winter coats she'd been saving because a child needed warmth yesterday, not in a neat, press-friendly timeline. It was those stories, unexpected and human, that hardened the steel of my resolve. The trial's climax came in late summer. A witness overheard my father admitting, in a voice meant for family only, that he had always assumed I would make concessions because I didn't need the money. The judge's gavel felt perfectly ordinary when he granted a preliminary injunction. My mother's expression, when the press released the transcript, was a private thing I reveled in for a long, quiet night. But hard as the law was, it didn't erase the public wound. My wedding, aborted, broadcast in whispers and screenshots, had left a bruise in the neighborhood and in my chest. There were people who stood with me and people who recoiled. Julian, bless him, had tried to remain, and then left, not because of the storm, but because he chose safety in the face of the weather. Relationships fall away when they aren't built on rock. And then came the twist I could not have predicted, the thing that felt like both the end and the beginning. My mother had always been theatrical. She loved the stage, charity galas, award nights, the subtle shadow of scandal corrected with a towel of public remorse. One humid August afternoon, a journalist I'd cooperated with called. "There's a file," she said, her voice tight with something like awe. "It's not about the money. It's about Esther's estate, about a clause only a smart, unconnected woman would write." She met me in a park with iced tea and an envelope thicker than a confession. Inside were copies of letters my grandmother had written to someone only identified as S in the margins. Letters that spoke in terse, loving phrases about keeping the family honest. They were private, tender things, but the name that kept appearing finally bared itself in a stamp, Sebastian Hale. I felt something like vertigo. My grandmother had not only known him, she'd trusted him enough to tie a clause in her will, a clause that made control of certain family assets contingent on demonstrable care. She had written, in Esther's unmistakable hand, that any member of the family diverting resources without explicit beneficiary assent would forfeit control to a designated trustee. And she had named Sebastian as trustee beneficiary if the clause was triggered. When I finally asked Sebastian about it, he put down his coffee, looked at me like he had seen me fully for the first time, and said, "Esther saved me once. She asked me to save what mattered to her. I accepted." My mother exploded, theatrically, predictably. "You've been working with him," she spat into the phone. "You traitor. You let that opportunist back into our life." "How strange that you think of me as an opportunist," Sebastian told her calmly, in a conversation that was leaked later like the last cruel scene of a play. "When your mother sewed me into her will, she knew you. She knew you so well she wrote a contingency precisely for you. She knew you'd never be satisfied by appearances alone." The twist of the twist, the part that turned theater into justice, was not that Sebastian had the legal power to freeze transfers. It was that he had the moral will to wield it. He had the resources, yes, but he also had the stubbornness of a man who believed in the commitments his grandmother's generation still honored, that promises to the vulnerable mean something beyond press photos. He didn't save me with a splash of wealth or a TV camera. He saved me by following my grandmother's exacting instructions. The trust he controlled, according to the clause, could be activated in the case of misappropriation by family trustees. When the court found clear evidence of said misappropriation, Sebastian's role shifted from an odd interloper in my mother's narrative to the executor of Esther's moral will. My family called him everything in their arsenal of small, desperate cruelties. My mother labeled him a billionaire interloper. My brother called him a fortune hunter, but he smiled at them like someone who'd read a long book and knew how the plot would surprise them. "Why do you help me?" I asked him one night after the worst of the hearings, when the city had gone to sleep and the law's teeth were still gleaming in court transcripts. He looked at me as if I had asked him to tell him which of his many saved things was his favorite. "Because your grandmother loved me like family," he said simply. He spoke like a man who refused to romanticize the past, because she insisted, and because you were quietly honest. You kept receipts for the right reasons. There are people in life who give you time. There are people who give you money. There are rare stranger gifts. Someone willing to put their name on the legal line and refuse to look away. Sebastian gave me that. He gave me the kind of ally that makes your small, meticulous courage into something the world can't ignore. The final hearing was theatrical, in a way that would have impressed my mother. Cameras, tears, a few supporters with signs, lawyers in crisp jackets that reminded me of funeral suits. My father sat ramrod straight, like a monarch who'd just been told a new constitution was being read out loud. My brother looked tired in a way that suggested he'd finally met consequence, and it didn't agree with him. The judge ruled, carefully, like a surgeon peeling back gauze. He found that trust funds and family donations had been misrepresented. He found that my parents had acted in bad faith by diverting funds without explicit beneficiary consent. He activated Esther's contingency clause and appointed Sebastian as the trustee to administer the disputed assets until the court ordered otherwise. There was no dramatic one-sentence gavel. Justice seldom provides such theatrics. But the legal recognition, the quiet recalculation of accounts, the freeze, the audit, felt like a tide beginning to lift. My father's empire stumbled on its own numbers. My mother, who had always measured worth in flattery and attendance lists, had to count in spreadsheets she couldn't charm. Malcolm retreated to a life that still needed money and care. He was not a villain in my mind. He was a person who'd been caught in the great family machine. I had loved him and still did, but love doesn't mean giving away your future so others can live on borrowed virtue. The legal judgment didn't punish him. It removed the mechanism that enabled a pattern. After the final papers were signed, Sebastian drove me to a diner. We ate pie like they used to do in the old days, with the kind of attention that tastes like legacy. You know, he said between bites, my grandmother told me once, if the ledger is dishonest, burn it, start again, but keep the people who are kind. I always thought kindness was how you'd fall for someone, I said, surprised at my own laughter. Kindness is how you survive. With yourself, he corrected. It's not a weakness. It's a compass. I watched his hands. To the world, he was a man who moved markets, but he used his power like someone who'd read his grandmother's handwriting and believed it more than law. He never wanted my public gratitude. He wanted my curiosity about the world he'd come from. We did not become lovers. There are narratives that insist a billionaire must sweep you away in some cinematic romance. But my story is not a screenplay. We became something steadier. Two people welded by shared memory and the desire to not let the past be wasted. He became a mentor of sorts, and later an ally who would quietly support my nonprofit work and ensure the clinics I dreamed about in long nights had funding without press photos attached. My mother, predictably, spun her stings of scandal into a new identity. The righteous matriarch wronged by a foreign benefactor. She tried to sue him for slander, for influence, for anything a practiced public face could muster. She lost with the same bewildered cruelty she had thrown at me for years. My father's firm took a reputational hit and, in an ironic twist, had to hire a compliance officer to audit its books. My brother and I made awkward, honest attempts at a relationship that was no longer transactional. The last scene with my mother is a quiet one. She sat at the estate, a house that was now measured by legal holdings rather than reputation, and I sat across from her with a cup of coffee and a patience I had not known I had until I had to wield it against her. You ruined us, she whispered, a plea and accusation braided together. No, I said, You did. She stared at me like she was trying to invent a new insult, but the vocabulary wouldn't hold. She was a woman who had made herself of appearances, and appearances now had less purchase. For what it's worth, she said finally, softer than the accusation she'd rehearsed for decades. I thought I was protecting the family. So did Grandma when she put that clause in her will, I replied. Protecting the family is not the same as protecting an image. People are not logos. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. The silence was not victory. It was an ending. Years later, when the dust had settled into a few neat boxes of memory, I stood at a small table in a new nonprofit center I'd started with seed funds that had nothing to do with headlines. Children came and went, hands sticky with juice boxes, eyes wide as satellite dishes for anything new. I had taught them to read, to write, to keep receipts, and to ask questions. I had taught them to be kind, but not to be unpaid labor for someone else's legacy. Sebastian stopped by, not as a billionaire, but as a man with good shoes and better attention. He sat in the back of the room and watched as a little boy recited the words of a book, with the fierce triumph of someone discovering a new planet. That look in his eye, Sebastian murmured when I met him afterward. It's contagious. It should be contagious, I said. Kindness. A better ledger. He smiled at me like he'd approve my balance sheet. Then he said something small and private. You kept your receipts for the right reasons. I looked at him and felt gratitude that did not need to be loud. He had saved me, yes, but not with spectacle. He had saved me by following a promise and reminding me that promises could be enforced not only by law, but by the honesty of someone who remembered they had been helped by the same hands. My mother watched from the periphery, like a person who had been given a front row seat to the consequences of her choices. She had been humiliated in the particular way a person of her station dares not be, publicly undone by the very legalism she'd weaponized. But humiliation cannot be the end of the story unless you let it. I did not let it be the end. In the end, justice here was not theatrical. It was arithmetic, procedure, and stubborn kindness. The billionaire my mother hated had saved me in the way my grandmother had wanted, by making the ledger honest and protecting the vulnerable he had known as a child in a church basement. He saved me by refusing to be a spectator to my erasure. He saved me by listening to a woman who had long ago taught him to measure value in human terms, not in artifacts and photos. My wedding fell apart that day on an altar under white lights. My life did not. Somewhere, in the aftermath of a family's vanity and a court's careful calculations, I learned to keep my own books. I learned that giving is not sacrificial by default, that it must be accounted for, honored, and never used as evidence that you are dispensable. When I tell the story now, I don't begin at the altar. I begin with a small conversation in a kitchen with my grandmother many years before she died. She pressed my hands in hers, hard and warm, and said, "Don't let anyone convince you that being kind makes you weak. Keep your receipts, girl, keep your receipts." I kept them. They were the thin thread that stitched me back together. The billionaire whom my mother hated, he kept a promise to my grandmother. He kept more than money. He kept a guardian's vigilance. At the end of the day, the revenge was not cruel. It was not meant to be. Karma didn't have to make people suffer for pleasure. The justice that feels best is the one where truth quietly does its work, and the people who use power like a club are asked to learn a new language, the language where people matter more than appearances. I have a small garden now, full of stubborn herbs and a stubborn child who loves lemon pie the way my grandmother did. Sometimes I see my mother from a distance at charity events, arranging names on a list like a woman who has realized lists are not the same as love. Sometimes she looks at me and says nothing. I don't need her to apologize. She gave me the lesson I needed through her mistakes. And sometimes, when the sky is the right kind of honest blue, Sebastian calls and asks if I want pie. We meet and talk about the children in the program and the odd, beautiful work of making a city kinder. He stays an honest presence. Not a rescuer, just an ally who honors promises. He is the proof that the world contains people who will answer when the ledger is dishonest. They humiliated me at my own wedding. they meant to break me in front of everyone. Instead, the truth found its small, stubborn way. The billionaire my mother hated saved me, not with fireworks, but with the slow, patient work of justice. And when justice is patient, it lasts. If this story touched your heart, if you've ever felt betrayed, silenced, or underestimated, then don't leave without showing your support. Hit that like button. It tells me you're standing with the narrator. Subscribe for more real, raw, emotional family drama stories just like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next twist-filled episode. And share this video with someone who needs to feel seen, heard, and understood today. Your support isn't just a click. It's a voice saying, I feel this, and I'm not alone. Stay strong, stay brave, and I'll meet you in the next story.